Hey, super scientists. We're looking at Ecology 6 in your Ecosystems Lab notebook on page 13. This is the second part, looking at the biogeochemical processes. We're going to be looking at the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle in this note section. So just to give you kind of an overview of the nitrogen cycle, this is going to be the process where nitrogen is passed through the biotic and abiotic factors in the ecosystem. So we have a lot of different things that are going on in this picture, and then I've given you a little bit of information down at the bottom below the picture to give you a better understanding of legumes, and that's something that is important in the cycling of nitrogen specifically. So we have nitrogen in the atmosphere is N2, and that is a molecule where you have diatomic nitrogen. So the N2 literally has two atoms of nitrogen that are bonded together. So in order for plants to use nitrogen, that nitrogen has to be converted from N2 into ammonia, has to be converted into NH4. So we have these special guys called rhizobia bacteria that can be found on plant roots, specifically on some types of plants that are legumes, and those are primarily going to be peas or beans, soybeans, green peas. So there are a lot of different types of legumes, so it's going to be kind of in the pea family. So those specific types of plants are going to contain the rhizobia bacteria, and those bacteria basically live on these little nodules on plant roots. And so when the nitrogen from the atmosphere ends up in the soil, as it absorbs into the soil, kind of being brought down into or infiltrating down into the soil with rainwater and that kind of thing, that nitrogen gets into the soil, and then so the rhizobia bacteria will convert that nitrogen from N2 to something that is a usable form of nitrogen, NH4. So it's a symbiotic relationship. It's mutualistic. Both organisms benefit. The plant benefits because the plant is going to get nitrates that it can use. And then the bacteria is also going to have a place to live, basically on the plant roots. You can also get nitrogen in the soil from decaying organisms, so an animal that has died, and poop. So poop is going to contain nitrate compounds, and certain animals have higher concentrations of nitrogen. Cows and rabbits, for example, they have pretty high concentrations of nitrogen in their poop. Little fun fact for you. So there's one other thing that is capable of nitrogen fixation. So we talked about the rhizobia bacteria that's able to convert N2 into NH4. So that's one organism. Bacteria is one organism that is capable of nitrogen fixation. And also lightning. Lightning is an example of another thing that can do nitrogen fixation, and that's because of the amount of energy that's released from lightning. So the energy basically splits apart that diatomic nitrogen, that N2, and so that will allow for those single nitrogen atoms to combine with oxygen. And when that happens, it forms NO, it forms nitrous oxides, and those nitrous oxides basically can dissolve in water and rainwater and are just carried down with the rainwater to the soil in the form of nitrates that can, again, be absorbed by plants to help them as sort of a natural fertilizer. Nitrogen is going to be released from volcanic activity. Again, nitrogen is going to be released from decaying organisms. So there's a lot of different ways that nitrogen can be released into the atmosphere or into the soil even. So here's the water cycle. You are probably familiar with the main three steps of the water cycle. So that's evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. There's a lot of other parts of the water cycle that go into the moving of water, the cycling of water throughout our atmosphere and down to the earth and underground. So once water gets heated up, so we've got water here in the ocean, water here in the lake and river. So once water gets heated up, those molecules are going to move quicker and quicker, and then they start evaporating up into the air. When they get cooled down, then they will condense into liquid droplets. And in order for clouds to form, the water vapor, the water that has evaporated, will have to cool down around condensation nuclei, which is just basically dust and dirt that are in the atmosphere. So when that water cools down around the condensation nuclei, then it will form clouds. So that's condensation that is occurring. And then we know precipitation is water falling from the clouds, rain, sleet, snow, or hail. And so when that water, those water droplets that have formed in the clouds, when they get heavy enough, then gravity will pull them downward. And then all of that kind of accumulates. Accumulation is, oddly enough, the term for that. So that water accumulates into lakes and rivers and the ocean. And if it's high enough elevation, if it's cold enough, then that will be snow or ice, of course. One other type of evaporation is transpiration. Transpiration is specifically evaporation from plants. And we know that the stomata, the little holes on the underside of leaves, can release and exchange different gases. So the stomata help with the gas exchange in leaves for photosynthesis. So it will allow for the plant to take in the carbon dioxide that it needs, and then will also release oxygen that we breathe in, and it also can release water vapor as well. So that's what's happening in this situation. These little water droplets are being transpired. They're being released through the stomata on the plants. Runoff is basically where you have water that's kind of moving across Earth's surface. It's basically like big puddles of water that are kind of moving, that have some kind of directionality moving downhill. Groundwater is going to be water underground. So water underground is going to be stored in a rock layer that's called the aquifer. Aqua means water, right? So the groundwater is going to be stored in the underground rock layer in that aquifer. So how does the aquifer get recharged? So if all this water ends up evaporating, or if this water is pumped up through a well and is used for water, and then there's no water left down here in the aquifer, there's no more groundwater, how does the aquifer end up becoming recharged? What do you think is going to add more water to it? These guys right here, parachuting downward, precipitation. So it rains, and the water lands on the soil, lands on the ground, and then it gets soaked into the ground. So rain is going to recharge an aquifer. Rain is going to provide the water that is needed to soak down into the ground to be part of the groundwater.